In the year 2019, a group of scientists at Fudan University in Shanghai made a discovery that changed the way we look at human history. They did not dig up old bones in the desert. They did not find a lost city. They did something much simpler and much more powerful. They looked inside the blood of living people. The team collected DNA samples from more than 11,000 people. These people came from every single province in China, from the far north to the deep south, from the coast to the mountains. Then the scientists did something nobody had done on this scale before. They took the genetic code of these modern people and placed it side by side with the genetic code of the world's oldest civilizations: Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley. The early societies of Central America, one by one, they checked for a match. And one by one, almost every civilization failed to match, except one. If you are new here, press the subscribe button now, because next week I'm going to show you DNA proof that Pacific Island sailors may have landed in South America 800 years before Columbus was even born. But today, we are talking about something bigger than one voyage. We are talking about the hidden genetic story of 1.4 billion people alive right now. And that story does not start where most people assume it starts. To understand why this matters, you first have to understand what the scientists were actually searching for. DNA works like a clock. It carries small changes, small mutations that build up over time, generation after generation. When one group of people splits into two separate groups, and those groups stop mixing with each other, their DNA slowly starts to drift apart. The longer the two groups stay apart, the bigger the genetic gap between them grows. This is how scientists can look at DNA today and figure out how closely or how distantly two populations are related. Here is where it gets strange. Chinese populations, despite living across a landmass roughly the size of the entire United States, show unusually low genetic variation. You would expect huge diversity across such a massive territory. Instead, scientists found something closer to genetic unity. That kind of pattern usually points to one thing: a single founding population that grew fast and spread wide. But if that is true, where did this founding population actually come from? Every non-African population on Earth today can trace its roots back to a wave of human migration that left Africa somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 years ago. And those early travelers spread out across Asia, then Europe, then eventually crossed into the Americas. As they moved into new lands, they adapted to new climates, ate new foods, and their DNA slowly changed to fit their new homes. So the Fudan researchers asked a very direct question. Out of all the ancient civilizations we know about, which one is genetically closest to the people living in China today? Where did the ancestors of 1.4 billion people actually come from? They started with the most famous ancient civilization of all, Egypt, the land of pharaohs, pyramids, and hieroglyphs, a society that lasted for thousands of years along the Nile River. Scientists pulled genetic material from Egyptian mummies and studied their haplogroups, which are basically genetic family branches passed down through mothers and fathers. When they compared these Egyptian haplogroups to modern Chinese DNA, the result was almost nothing. The genetic branches simply did not connect. Whatever thread links ancient Egypt to the rest of the human family, it does not lead to modern China. Next, the team studied Mesopotamia, the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, often called the birthplace of writing and farming. DNA pulled from Sumerian and Babylonian burial sites showed its own unique genetic signature. Once again, there was almost no overlap with the Chinese samples. The mutation patterns pointed in a different direction entirely. Then came the Indus Valley civilization, home to the ancient cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, which flourished in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. Geographically, this was the closest ancient civilization to China on the list, so researchers expected at least some meaningful genetic connection. What they found instead was a small trace, not a real bloodline. One particular haplogroup common in the Indus Valley showed up in less than 2% of the Chinese samples. That is not the sign of two peoples merging together. That is the sign of two peoples who occasionally traded goods along ancient routes, but who never really mixed as families. The researchers then turned to the Americas, studying ancient Mesoamerican groups such as the Maya and the Aztec. These populations are believed to have descended from groups that crossed the Bering Land Bridge somewhere between 15 and 20,000 years ago, coming originally from Siberia. Because of that shared Asian route, scientists expected to find at least a distant echo of connection, and they did find one, but it was faint. A haplogroup common among Native American populations appeared in less than 1% of modern Chinese DNA. The two branches had split apart so long ago during the last ice age that almost no genetic trace remained. The team did not stop there. They checked ancient Anatolian farmers, the people connected to the earliest known temple sites, and among the first to build organized agricultural societies. Practically no overlap. They checked early European hunter-gatherers. Practically no overlap there either. That were already present in that region long before. Civilization after civilization, the same result kept repeating. No shared bloodline, no genetic bridge, no common ancestor. It was starting to look like Chinese populations had no ancient genetic partner anywhere in the historical record. Then the scientists compared modern Chinese DNA to remains from the Yellow River civilization, and everything changed. The Yellow River civilization began roughly 7,000 years ago on the flat, fertile plains of what is now northern China. This is not a civilization most people ever hear about in school. There are no towering pyramids left standing, no giant stone temples that survived the centuries. The people of the Yellow River built with wood and packed earth, materials that decay and disappear over thousands of years. But their impact on history did not disappear with their buildings. Excavations at ancient sites in this region uncovered something remarkable. These were not simple farmers scratching out a living. They were innovators. They created pottery decorated with detailed painted patterns. They carved early symbols, the very beginnings of Chinese writing, into bones and shells. They built round houses arranged into organized villages, showing real social planning. Their farming was based on foxtail millet and broomcorn millet, crops they domesticated on their own, completely separate from the wheat and barley being grown at the same time in the Middle East. They were not copying anyone. They were building their own system, suited to their own land. Buildings decay, pottery breaks, but DNA survives. And when researchers compared the genetic material pulled from Yellow River burial sites to the DNA of people living in China today, the match was unmistakable. One particular Y chromosome haplogroup, passed down from father to son, showed up in over 60% of the Yellow River remains and remains the most common paternal genetic line in China today. Mitochondrial haplogroups, passed down from mother to child, lined up at similarly high rates. This was not a small coincidence. This was direct, unbroken genetic continuity. The researchers went even further. They studied tiny genetic markers called single nucleotide variations, essentially single letters in the DNA code that can differ from person to person. By tracking exactly which of these tiny variations appeared in the ancient Yellow River samples and comparing them to modern people, scientists could measure precisely how much genetic drift had happened across 7,000 years. The answer was almost none. Genetic markers linked to traits like lactose sensitivity, hair type, eye shape, and skin tone matched at strikingly similar rates between the ancient population and modern northern Chinese people. This was not a loose family resemblance. This was a direct, traceable bloodline. In other words, the ancestors of modern Chinese people were not living in Egypt. They were not living in Mesopotamia. They were farming millet along the banks of the Yellow River, inventing their own writing system, and laying the foundation for what would eventually grow into one of the largest and longest-lasting civilizations on Earth. For more than 100 years, many Western historians followed something called the diffusion theory of civilization. This theory claimed that advanced societies only ever appeared in a few key places, like Egypt or Mesopotamia, and then spread outward to the rest of the world through trade, migration, or conquest. If a culture had writing or farming or cities, the assumption was often that they must have learned it from somewhere else. China never fit neatly into that theory. Chinese script looks nothing like cuneiform or hieroglyphics. Chinese farming grew around rice and millet, not wheat and barley. Chinese metalworking, Chinese philosophy, Chinese systems of government, none of it resembles a copy of something borrowed from elsewhere. The genetic findings simply confirm what the physical archaeology had already been suggesting for years. Chinese civilization grew up on its own, right where it started, from a single founding population, and it kept that genetic identity remarkably intact for 7,000 years. But the story does not end with a population that just stayed still for 7,000 years. The Yellow River people expanded, and the genetic record shows exactly how that expansion unfolded. Around 5,000 years ago, groups from the Yellow River Basin began pushing southward. They carried their millet farming with them, along with their language and their tools, and of course, their DNA. When they reached the Yangtze River Basin, they ran into a completely different population, a group of rice farmers who had already been living and working that land for thousands of years, with their own distinct genetic markers passed down through their own family lines. These southern rice farmers were not a scattered, disorganized people. Archaeological sites show that wet rice farming had been practiced in that region for at least 8,000 years, with advanced stilt houses built above water and skilled jade carving traditions all their own. They had developed independently, on a completely separate path from the Yellow River communities to the north. So, what happened when these two populations met? The genetic data tells the story clearly. Intermarriage, blending. The Yellow River bloodline moved south and grew strong there, but it never fully wiped out the original southern population. Instead, the two groups merged, creating the layered genetic picture we see in southern China today, a population that is mostly descended from the Yellow River founders, but carries a real and measurable trace of the original Yangtze rice farmers. That mixture is not spread evenly. In regions like Zhejiang and Fujian, right in the historical heartland of Yangtze rice farming, ancestry from the original southern population makes up around a quarter to nearly a third of the local genetic profile. Move further north, into areas like Jiangsu and Anhui, and that southern contribution drops to somewhere around 15 to 20%. It is a clear, steady gradient. The closer you get to the old Yellow River core, the stronger the Yellow River ancestry becomes. Yet even far in the south, in provinces like Guangdong and Guangxi, over 1,000 kilometers from where it all began, Yellow River ancestry still makes up roughly 70 to 75% of the local genetic makeup. This was not a small, half-hearted migration. It was a slow, steady, and remarkably successful expansion. A similar story played out when Yellow River populations pushed westward into what is now Sichuan and the Tibetan Plateau. Genetic markers from the Yellow River founders show up clearly in Tibetan populations today, but blended together with distinct highland genetic markers. Tibetan populations carry something extra, something the lowland Chinese populations simply do not have. A genetic variant connected to processing oxygen efficiently at extreme high altitude appears in roughly 80% of Tibetan people, but is almost completely absent in lowland Han Chinese populations. This tells us something important. When Yellow River farmers moved up into the Tibetan Plateau, they mixed with people who had already adapted, over thousands of years, to survive and thrive at elevations above 4,000 meters. Without absorbing those highland genes, that expansion into such an extreme environment might never have succeeded at all. By roughly 3,000 years ago, the basic genetic blueprint of the people who would eventually be known as the Han Chinese was already set. It was a foundation of Yellow River ancestry, blended with varying amounts of southern and western influence depending on the region. And remarkably, that genetic blueprint has stayed stable ever since. This is exactly what makes the Fudan research so significant. When scientists compare the DNA of people living in China today with DNA pulled from remains that are 2,000, 3,000, even 5,000 years old, the continuity is obvious. The same core genetic markers, the same underlying patterns. Researchers examined tombs from the Han Dynasty, dating back roughly 2,000 years, and found genetic profiles that line up almost perfectly with people living in northern China today. They studied Shang Dynasty remains, dating back over 3,000 years, and got the same result. The genetic thread held firm through dynasty after dynasty, through wars, and through political upheaval. Now compare that to Europe. European populations went through massive genetic disruption over roughly the same span of time. Herding groups from the Central Asian steppes swept into Europe around 5,000 years ago and, in some regions, replaced up to 90% of the existing male population. DNA from Bronze Age. Britain shows a dramatic genetic shift once new cultural groups arrived on the island, all within just a few centuries. Modern Europeans are, genetically speaking, a patchwork, layer after layer of different ancestral populations stacked on top of one another. Chinese populations tell a very different story. Continuity, stability, a single founding population that grew, absorbed its neighbors gradually but was never wiped out or fully replaced. Even during the Mongol conquest, one of history's most dramatic military takeovers, the genetic impact was surprisingly small. Scientists can detect a trace of Mongol ancestry in northern Chinese populations today, but it typically sits below 2%. The Mongols ruled over China for close to 100 years, yet they barely left a mark on the underlying population's genetics. So why? What allowed Chinese populations to remain so genetically stable while so much of the world experienced constant disruption and replacement? Part of the answer is geography. The Yellow River Basin sits surrounded by natural barriers, mountains to the west and south, deserts to the north, and the ocean to the east. These barriers did not make the region impossible to invade, but they did create enough isolation to let one population dominate the genetic landscape for thousands of years. The Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau form a nearly impassable wall to the southwest. The Taklamakan and Gobi deserts create another barrier to the northwest. The rugged mountains of southwestern China made large-scale migration extremely difficult. Because of this, the expansion of Yellow River populations mostly followed river valleys and lowland corridors, places where farming was actually possible. And any outside groups that did arrive had usually already mixed genetically with northern populations before getting there. Farming was another major factor. Millet agriculture in the north and rice agriculture in the south supported dense, stable populations, and dense populations are hard to displace. During the Bronze Age, the Yellow River Basin could support around 100 people per square kilometer, compared to just 1 or 2 people per square kilometer across the steppe regions to the north. When that kind of population gap exists, even a successful military conquest rarely leads to real genetic replacement. There simply are not enough invaders to outnumber the local population. There was a third factor too, and it might be the most powerful one: cultural continuity. Chinese civilization developed a shared writing system, an organized bureaucratic government, and a strong cultural identity that survived across dynasty after dynasty. When the Mongols took control of China in the 13th century, they did not erase Chinese culture or Chinese genetics. Instead, they adopted Chinese systems of government, intermarried with Chinese families, And within just a few generations, their genetic footprint had blended into the wider population. The imperial examination system, which selected government officials based on mastery of classical texts, created a powerful incentive for non-Chinese rulers and elites to adopt Chinese culture themselves. Mongol and later Manchu nobles, who wanted real political power, had to learn the language, study the classics, and essentially become culturally Chinese. Their children married into local families, and within a handful of generations, any separate identity simply dissolved. Writing played a huge role in holding everything together. Chinese characters stayed remarkably consistent, even as spoken dialects across the country drifted apart. Someone from the far north and someone from the far south might not understand a word of each other's spoken language, yet they could both read and write the exact same characters. This created a shared literate culture that crossed regional boundaries and reinforced one common identity, generation after generation. The same pattern repeated almost 400 years later with the Manchu conquest in the 17th century. Political power changed hands, but the deeper genetic and cultural foundation stayed intact. Qing dynasty rulers tried for a time to keep Manchu and Han populations separate, but intermarriage happened anyway, especially among the ruling elite. By the final years of the Qing dynasty, most Manchu families carried significant Han Chinese ancestry. So what did the Fudan study actually prove? It did more than just find one genetic match among many possible ancient civilizations. It documented 7,000 years of genetic continuity that somehow survived empires rising and falling, invasions, famines, and constant political change. That is not just an interesting scientific footnote. It is, in a real sense, historically unprecedented. You cannot honestly argue that Chinese civilization was some kind of copy or offshoot of a Western civilization when the DNA shows essentially zero genetic connection between them. The ancestors of the people living in China today were never in Mesopotamia. They were never in Egypt. They were on the banks of the Yellow River, quietly building their own farming systems, their own writing, and their own complex society, entirely independent of anything happening on the other side of the world. This also helps explain something historians have wondered about for a long time. Why did Chinese civilization never experience a true, complete collapse the way so many other ancient civilizations did? Egypt went through repeated periods of collapse. Mesopotamia fractured into pieces. The Indus Valley civilization vanished almost entirely. Rome eventually fell apart completely. China went through cycles too, periods of division followed by reunification, but the civilization as a whole never truly collapsed. The writing system never disappeared, the agricultural foundation never failed completely. The genetic and cultural thread simply never broke. Now we understand at least part of the reason why. The population itself stayed remarkably stable. The people farming the Yellow River Basin today are, in a very real genetic sense, direct descendants of the people farming that same land 5,000 years ago. That kind of long-term stability builds resilience. It builds continuity of knowledge and tradition. It builds a civilization that can take a hit and keep moving forward. The Fudan research also uncovered interesting regional differences within China itself. When researchers broke the data down by province, northern Chinese populations showed the strongest, most direct genetic link back to the original Yellow River founders. Southern populations showed more blending with the original Yangtze rice farmers, along with small genetic traces connected to Southeast Asian populations. The regional pattern was clear and consistent. Populations from Henan, Shanxi, and Shaanxi, sitting right in the historical heartland of the Yellow River civilization, showed somewhere between 85 and 90% Yellow River ancestry, essentially direct descendants of the original millet farmers, with very little outside blending. Move further south into Hunan, Hubei, and Jiangxi, and Yellow River ancestry drops to around 70 to 75%, with the remaining share coming from Yangtze rice farmers and other earlier southern groups. Western populations, particularly around Sichuan and near the Tibetan Plateau, show their own unique blend, roughly 75% Yellow River ancestry, combined with meaningful contributions from Tibetan highland groups and earlier southwestern populations. But in every single region examined, one thing stayed constant. Yellow River ancestry was always the dominant foundation, the base that every other regional influence blended into. This changes how we should think about Chinese identity as a whole. The idea of one single uniform Han Chinese ethnicity is really more of a cultural and political concept than a strict genetic reality. Genetically, it makes more sense to picture something closer to a spectrum, a shared Yellow River foundation with different amounts of regional blending layered on top, depending on geography and history. And yet, even accounting for all of that regional variation, the underlying continuity remains striking. A person from northern China and a person from southern China are, on average, genetically closer to each other than a person from northern Europe is to a person from southern Europe. That is what 7,000 years of relative genetic stability actually looks like in practice. And this pattern is not limited to people currently living inside China's borders. Chinese communities that migrated over the centuries to Southeast Asia, Taiwan, and countless other regions around the world still carry these same core genetic markers. The Yellow River genetic signature shows up consistently in overseas Chinese communities everywhere. It is a single genetic thread connecting well over 1 billion people back to one ancient source. The findings also raised new questions worth thinking about. If the Yellow River civilization really was the primary ancestral source for modern Chinese populations, what happened to whatever groups were living in that same region before 7,000 years ago? The genetic evidence suggests those earlier groups were not wiped out. They were absorbed. The Yellow River expansion did not erase the populations it encountered. It slowly folded them in through intermarriage, cultural blending, and gradual genetic mixing. Over thousands of years, the Yellow River signature became the dominant thread, but small traces of those earlier populations still linger inside the DNA of people living in China today. This stands in real contrast to what appears to have happened in parts of Europe, where steppe migrations seem to have almost completely replaced earlier populations in certain regions. In China, the process was slower, gentler, and far more integrative. Since 2019, other research teams around the world have gone back and tested these same questions independently, and every follow-up study has reached the same basic conclusion. Modern Chinese populations trace back overwhelmingly to the Yellow River civilization, with only minimal genetic input from any other ancient civilization on record. The implications of this reach far beyond just Chinese history. It reshapes how we should think about human migration and the birth of complex societies in general. It proves that advanced complex civilizations can rise up completely independently, in total isolation, without borrowing their foundation from any single outside source. It also shows that genuine genetic continuity across thousands of years is entirely possible, under the right combination of conditions: the right geography, the right agricultural base, the right level of cultural resilience. Put those three things together, and you get a population that can stay remarkably stable, even while entire empires rise and collapse all around it. So when scientists finally sat down and compared Chinese DNA against every major ancient civilization on record, only one civilization actually matched. And that was not some strange historical coincidence. It happened because Chinese civilization grew up right where it started, from one founding population on the banks of the Yellow River, and somehow managed to hold onto that genetic thread for 7,000 unbroken years. That is not just a fascinating scientific finding. It is a complete rewrite of how we should understand one of the oldest continuous civilizations still standing on Earth today. The DNA tells its own story, and that story does not lie. The ancestors of 1.4 billion people were out there farming millet along the Yellow River 7,000 years ago, and remarkably, their descendants are still standing on that same land today. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Next week, we are diving into the DNA evidence pulled from the mummies of the Tarim Basin, and why their strikingly European features, found in the middle of Western China, have geneticists rethinking everything they thought they knew about ancient migration routes. That video is already live on the channel, so go check it out right now.